Charles DeRudio was an Italian aristocrat and a career U.S. Army officer who fought in the 7th U.S. Cavalry Regiment at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He was known as Count No Account by Captain Frederick Benteen due to his boastful storytelling and haughty manner. DeRudio was a good officer and was promoted to first lieutenant on December 15, 1875, but he was not well liked by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and other senior officers. DeRudio survived the Battle of Little Bighorn and later wrote a letter describing his experiences during the battle. I narrowly escaped the perils of the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25th and 26th, and I am here to share my harrowing first-hand account of this epic confrontation. At around 10 a.m. on June 25th, General Custer's scouts returned with startling news. They had discovered an Indian village approximately 15 miles away, nestled along the Little Bighorn. The scouts observed that the Indians appeared to be retreating from our advancing forces. We continued our march for another 2 or 3 miles before General Custer called a halt to strategize our assault. He assigned Companies H, D, and K under Colonel F.W. Benteen to cover our left flank with explicit orders to clear everything in their path. Companies M and G, commanded by Colonel Reno, and where I found myself temporarily attached to Company A, took the center position. General Custer himself led Companies E, I, F, L, and C on the right side of the attack line, while Company B remained behind to guard the pack train. After marching another few miles, our center unit received orders to trot and maintain pace until reaching the river some 6 or 7 miles away. Upon reaching the river, we forded it and emerged onto the plains beyond, where we were instructed to form a battle line. With orders given, we set off at a gallop, pursuing the enemy through a dense and blinding dust cloud stirred up by the fleeing Indians. The dust was so thick that visibility was almost zero, prompting Colonel Reno to halt the battalion. After dismounting, Colonel Reno swiftly organized a skirmish line, positioning the right flank along the edge of a dry, densely wooded creek. While the horses were being led to shelter in the woods, the Indians launched a fierce assault, which we met with immediate return fire, and the skirmish continued for about half an hour. It was then discovered that across the creek, in a park-like clearing, there were a few lodges. Our entire line crossed the creek to find the lodges abandoned, only to be met by about 200 yelling warriors. The overwhelming fire from this larger force made retreat nearly impossible, as we found ourselves surrounded. Entering the battle with only 100 men, the enemy's relentless fire wreaked havoc on our small group. As we crossed the creek, I, positioned at the rear, noticed a guidon left behind and went back to retrieve it. While navigating through the woods, the guidon got tangled in the branches and slipped from my grasp. Dismounting to pick it up, I led my horse to the south bank of the creek. Just as I was about to mount, a bullet struck my horse, causing it to panic and bolt into the Indians' ranks, leaving me dismounted with about 300 Sioux just 50 yards away. They unleashed a whistling volley at me, but miraculously, I remained unscathed. I managed to escape to a nearby thicket where I could defend myself and negotiate my survival. In the thicket, I encountered Fred Gerard, the interpreter, and Private Thomas F. O'Neill from Company G, 7th Cavalry. Gerard and O'Neill had their horses, while I, like O'Neill, was dismounted. I suggested that having the horses could give away our position and recommended stampeding them, but they declined. Leaving them, I crawled through the dense undergrowth into the deep, dry bottom of the creek, hoping to stay hidden until darkness fell, allowing me to sneak back and rejoin the command. After about 10 tense minutes in my hiding place, I heard several pistol shots fired nearby, followed by the eerie voices of several squaws. Cautiously raising my head, I observed these women engaging in the gruesome act of scalping a soldier who might still have been alive. 2 of them were engrossed in the cutting, while the others performed a war dance around the victim and his mutilators. The horror of this repulsive spectacle is beyond words. Eventually, the women left, likely in search of more victims, giving me a moment to contemplate my precarious situation. While grappling with my thoughts, I noticed a crackling noise nearby. Upon investigation, I realized it came from burning wood the Indians had set afire. The exceptionally dry wood caused the fire to spread quickly, forcing me to abandon my hiding spot in the creek. I crawled out of the creek bottom using the same route as before. Just as I was about to climb the bank, I heard a voice calling, "Lieutenant." "Lieutenant," though I couldn't see anyone, the call persisted. Advancing a few yards in the direction of the voice, I found the entire party I had left a short time ago concealed in the creek bottom. Mr. Gerard informed me that he had left the horses tied together where I had seen them and followed down after me. Like me, the party was concerned about the advancing fire. Fortunately, the wind subsided and a light rain fell, enough to halt the flames and renew our hope of remaining hidden until nightfall. It was now 3 p.m., and we had 6 long hours to wait. Throughout this time, we could hear and occasionally glimpse Indians around us, their voices eerily close. It's difficult to find words to describe the multitude of thoughts that crossed my mind during those suspenseful hours. Finally, nightfall arrived, with the sky heavily clouded, providing the cover we needed. We could finally emerge from our concealed positions and head towards the ford, situated 2 miles to the south across an open plain. Mr. Gerard and the scout mounted their horses, while the soldier and I each grabbed onto a horse's tail. Following them through the darkness, Mr. Gerard suggested that if he needed to flee and leave us behind, he would inform Colonel Reno of our whereabouts, ensuring our rescue. As we traversed the open plain, the night was so dark we could barely see, but we could hear Indians returning to their village. Reaching the woods near what we believed to be the ford we had crossed earlier that morning, we realized our mistake and had to search for the correct crossing. After fording the stream once, we discovered it was at a bend, necessitating another crossing. As we recrossed the river, we unexpectedly encountered 8 warriors. The 2 mounted men fled immediately, while the soldier and I dove into nearby bushes. I cocked my revolver, kneeling and ready to fire if the warriors approached. Remarkably, they seemed to think we had all fled and, after conversing amongst themselves for a few tense minutes, continued on their way. Relieved, I called out to the soldier and we regrouped. Realizing that all fords were well guarded, attempting to cross the river seemed suicidal. The night dragged on, and at dawn we heard what sounded like a large cavalry unit approaching, with a distinct sound of horses splashing through water. Carefully approaching the riverbank, I saw what appeared to be our command. Gray horses ridden by men in military blouses, some with white hats. From my vantage point, I watched as they left the valley, some troops climbing a steep bluff while others continued to cross the river. This sight filled me with a mix of hope and apprehension, wondering if we had finally found our salvation. I spotted a man in a buckskin jacket, pants, top boots, and a white hat, and I was certain it was Captain Tom Custer, convincing me that these cavalrymen were from our command. Convinced, I confidently stepped onto the bank and called out, "Tom, don't leave us here." The distance was only a few yards, and my call was met with a terrifying war cry and a barrage of 300 or 400 shots. It was then that I realized my error. The warriors were dressed in clothing and riding horses seized from our men. The soldier and I swiftly dove into the bushes as bullets sheared through branches with each volley. We crawled away to escape the line of fire, disturbing the top branches of the undergrowth, prompting the Indians on the bluff to fire in our direction. We decided to cross a clearing of about 20 yards to reach another wooded area. Before proceeding, I took the precaution of surveying the surroundings. The outlook was profoundly disheartening. On our immediate right, just 50 yards away, I spotted 4 or 5 Indians rapidly approaching. Close to me were the cottonwood stumps almost touching each other. Behind this makeshift barricade, the soldier and I knelt down. He held his carbine while I gripped my revolver, prepared to take down a few of the warriors before they could harm us. They hadn't noticed us, and when the leading man was just 10 yards away, I took a shot. They were moving in single file, and upon my shot, they abruptly turned around, making a quick exit. Private O'Neill then fired his carbine at the second warrior, who was at that moment pulling his pony to turn him back. The private's aim was true and his carbine reliable as the Native American dropped his reins, raised his hands, and lay down on the grass for his eternal rest. The gentleman I had initially greeted rode a short distance and then followed suit. The rest of the group rode on, turned the corner of the wood, and vanished. Throughout this period, the gunfire from the bluffs persisted, but after our shots it ceased and we retreated to the thicket. From our position, we observed the Indians on the bluffs, their horses tethered under the protection of the hill, and a row of sharpshooters lying prone on their stomachs. The sounds of battle echoed from above on the hills, the sustained rattle of musketry, the cheers of our fellow soldiers, and the shouts of the Native Americans. Our spirits lifted when we recognized the familiar cheer of our comrades, but disappointment quickly set in as we realized that our woodland refuge was ablaze, forcing us to relocate. We crawled nearly to the edge of the woodland when we noticed that the adversaries had ignited both sides. We maneuvered until we discovered a dense cluster of what they refer to as mulberry trees, under which we crept. The grass on the fringe of this area was very green, having experienced a slight drizzle shortly before, and there was no wind. As the fire approached our concealment, it spread very slowly, allowing me to smother it with my gauntlet gloves. The fire around us had burned down, leaving us in a small, safe area. We were surrounded by fire, but it protected us from the outside. We could see everything around us without being seen. We watched Native Americans moving around and one standing guard about 70 to 80 yards away, watching the fire. At 4 p.m., he fired 4 shots into the air, which I thought was a signal. Then we heard a Native American shouting loudly, repeating the same sound 4 times. After these signals, we saw over 200 Native Americans leaving the area and crossing the river. An hour later, the same signals were repeated, and many more Native Americans rode away on horseback. Soon, the rest of them left too. We felt hopeful and the constant gunfire slowed down, with only occasional distant shots heard. By 6 p.m., everything around us seemed peaceful, with no signs of Native Americans nearby. We thought the regiment had left the battlefield, and we just had to wait until nightfall to cross the river and head towards the Yellowstone River. There, we planned to build a raft and float down to the Powder River, where our supply camp was. We had gone 36 hours without water or food. At 8 p.m., we waded through the river, crossed it twice, and climbed up the bluffs, carefully deciding which direction to go. We moved slowly and cautiously, covering to miles before I climbed a high hill to look around and check for any signs of our command. I saw a fire about 2 miles away, in the direction where we thought our command was fighting. We wondered if it was a Native American fire or our command's. We decided to approach cautiously and see what we could find. We went down the hill and headed towards the fire, climbing hills and stopping to listen, proceeding for over a mile. When we reached the top of the hill, we stopped and listened again. We heard voices, but they were too faint to tell if they belonged to Native Americans or our own command. We moved a bit closer and heard a mule bray, followed by a sentry's familiar challenge, "Halt, who goes there?" The challenge wasn't aimed at us, since we were too far away and hidden in the darkness. But it gave us the confidence to keep approaching cautiously, still worried about running into Native Americans. We were about 200 yards from the fire when I shouted, "Picket, don't fire." It's Lieutenant DeRudio and Private O'Neill, and started running towards them. Our announcement was met with a loud cheer from the picket and Lieutenant Varnum. Lieutenant Varnum, a brave and efficient officer, came up to me, overjoyed to see me alive since he had assumed I was among the casualties. I asked about the regiment's status, hoping we were the only casualties, but that hope was short-lived. Lieutenant Varnum told me he had no news about the 5 companies under Custer and that our command had lost Lieutenants McIntosh and Hodgson. I arrived at camp around 2 a.m. and couldn't sleep despite being exhausted from 2 nights without rest. I talked to Lieutenant Varnum about the battle, sharing my close calls and adventures. Morning came soon, and I met with the officers to let them know the Native Americans had left. At 8 a.m., we saw cavalry approaching, first a few scouts, then a large column. We soon realized it was General Brisbane's command coming to relieve us. Later, a long line of infantry appeared on the plain, and General Gibbon arrived. Seeing those blue coats filled our hearts with emotion. When Generals Gibbon and Terry entered our camp, grown men cried like children. I must acknowledge Private O'Neill's loyalty and bravery. He followed my orders and stood by me like a brother. I'll always remember him and his valuable service during our dangerous time together. This courageous soldier is highly respected by his company commander and will always have my gratitude and that of my comrades, Charles C. DeRudio,